This episode touches on some sensitive themes related to violence, so please listen and watch with care.
The first youth clubs were set up by women for factory girls. The youth club and the kind of dance floor are not separate entities. They're just different corners of the same room. You've got tech billionaires and then you've got like narco land really heavily embedded in the lives of our young people.
Hi, I'm Ciaran Thapar and this is Safe, a conversation about violence affecting young people with adults trying to stop it. Teenagers who are directly affected by violence are twice as likely to attend a youth club. Youth clubs might be one of our best chances of keeping young people safe. But over the last 15 years, thousands of them across the UK have closed. So what's their history? Why are they so important? And how can we protect them? I'm sitting down with cultural historian Emma Warren to talk about her new book, Up the Youth Club, which tells the story of youth clubs in Britain. Emma Warren, welcome to Safe.
Thank you for having me.
How did you keep safe when you were a child?
This is such an interesting question because, first of all, I can't help but reframe it as how did we keep each other safe when we were children? Because none of this happens in a kind of isolated way. It's really important to understand what kind of risks a person faced in order to understand how they kept themselves safe. So, what kind of risks did I face growing up in a, suburban, really edge of southeast London sort of scenario? Well, actually, like lots of young people, I faced the risk of dodgy adults. I faced the risk of, teenage drinking, that kind of thing. How did I sort of manage those risks? Well, I suppose the way I kept myself safe, that we kept each other safe, would have been being part of things. So whether that was like youth club or like trampoline club on a Saturday afternoon down at the sports centre, or all those sorts of things, or sort of if I'm thinking about the age group of like 10 to 14, sort of childish, or youngster as maybe they might have been called in the past. We would have kept each other safe by being part of things, being around each other as people of the same age, and being around adults who weren't in the category of dodgy adult.
You referred to them just now, the word youth club. So let's get straight into it. You obviously attended a youth club and have, since being a child, worked at youth clubs, visited youth clubs. It's been a big part of your life in some way. All the way along, and your book Up the Youth Club, which I've got here and have just finished reading and really enjoyed it. You've been researching this for a few years, but you've also been researching and writing about like grassroots culture for decades. As like a music journalist, you're like you're a veteran in the game. What made you turn to youth clubs?
I mean, it's so funny because like I said before, I didn't keep myself, we kept each other safe. The youth club and the kind of dance floor are not separate entities. They're just different corners of the same room. And so to me, they are the same thing. My first exposure to like proper music culture, was at an under-18s night, which is essentially a youth club run by people who ran like soul and funk pirate radio in the mid-80s. And so those traditions which exist within music culture, particularly global majority music culture, which is about creating something for the younger ones, I was lucky enough to benefit from. So to me, they're not different. There was a chapter in my last book, Dance Your Way Home, called Up the Youth Club. So I just self-bootlegged myself for that title. But I think they're the same thing.
Okay, so it's a natural continuation.
Absolutely.
The next chapter.
It's part of the sort of the double helix or the spiral of the way in which community spaces are necessary for all of us. And by catering to the youngest or the most vulnerable of us, we benefit everybody, because those youth club spaces have been used for music culture repeatedly throughout the timeline.
I think it's like page 3 of the book. You kind of define what a youth club is to you. A central quality connects all the spaces in this book, whether they're attended by 5 young people or 500, in a shed or in a purpose-built centre. A youth club, as far as I'm concerned, is a broadly warm and welcoming space where those who are in their second decade of life can gather regularly, in person, without compulsion, to do things they like doing or to discover what they like doing, where restorative hanging out is welcome. Where does the story of this kind of space begin?
The space is so important, and I will answer your question, but I do just want to say first that I recognise that so much youth work happens outside of a designated space. So in a way there I'm talking about the ideal youth club, but I also recognise that you have youth workers and you have kind of entities and projects doing this work that are making do with a lot less than the kind of ideal space that I'm talking about. And of course, there's also mobile spaces and all that sort of stuff, you know, and what used to be called sort of detached youth work. So I really do value all of that as well. But the story of the youth club, as you might imagine it, and everyone will have a slightly different version in their heads of what we're talking about, really goes back to the Industrial Revolution, where wealth disparities in this country were broader than anywhere else, wider than anywhere else. And so the horrific outcomes of wealth disparity caused people to do something about it on a grassroots level. So as you had lots of people moving into the cities and you had this huge wealth disparity and this unbelievable poverty, people who had a little bit more time, more money or structural power created something. And actually the history of the youth club is also the history of girls and the history of girls' work, because the first youth clubs were set up by women for factory girls, rest and recreation rooms for factory girls. And, you know, girls and young women have been so often left behind in the youth work story that I think it's important to remember that they're at the beginning. It's because of them.
And it kind of moves through different phases over the next, 150 years up until the present time. You've got youth clubs existing in mission houses. You've got the tipping point of like a state-provided youth service at the start of World War II. You've got the role of youth leaders becoming youth workers. And so I guess the like professionalization of what a youth worker is, when it was maybe a less formal term before. And you've also got all these cycles of sort of battling funding cuts and sort of surviving political cycles, which was one of the big takeaways for me, is that we have been here before. Which I guess is just a lesson of history generally, right? So there's all these different phases, you know, aside from all the impact on music that you chart, on sport, on art, on like inclusive spaces for minority groups. What most surprised you in your sort of journey researching all of this stuff?
I mean, there are so many surprises, I think, but that surprise kind of comes to the territory, because if you're dealing with youth, you're dealing with things that are happening but haven't yet reached the mainstream. So it's surprising if you were to go down to a youth space today, this afternoon, next week, something surprising would happen, no doubt. So the whole history of the youth club is full of those kind of surprises. I think one thing is really just that sinking in of understanding that, as you said, we've been here before. And if I'm saying that the history of youth work tracks back to a moment of huge wealth inequality, well, where are we now? This country has the biggest wealth inequality, or the biggest growth of wealth inequality in comparable countries. And so the need for the youth club is partly to do with the needs that we have here in this country, to do with the way that life happiness or life chances track negatively alongside wealth inequality.
And I guess rates of child poverty having been on the rise for the last 10, 15 years.
Absolutely.
Economic stagnation, meaning that wages are obviously in the state that they're in, and people just finding the cost of living, you know, all of that puts a pressure on young people.
Absolutely.
And creates a need for spaces like this to exist even more.
Absolutely.
Right? Anyone that's worked in a youth club, which I have done, and I have to shout out my mentor, Ira Campbell, at Marcus Lipton in South London, which is cited in the book. I was really glad to see. There are these characters in youth clubs all around the country who have that intergenerational presence, who have those stories under their belt. They've got respect from everyone that walks in the door, from the parents to the children, aunties, uncles, caretakers, everyone. The book is basically kind of pieced together from these different voices, right? And these different characters who you meet all across the country. Can you just talk me through one of them? I know it's going to be hard to pick one.
I can't, but it's so difficult because in a way, this is a good way for me to explain the degree of responsibility that I feel for everybody in the book. And there were points where I was writing it where I was completely overwhelmed by this sense of responsibility, as if I was personally responsible for every young person who'd ever been to any youth club, and that I was responsible for the youth workers as well. Because this is the power of the story, isn't it? And actually, I think anyone involved in this work needs to feel a great deal of responsibility, because it is an unbelievably important area of the world, and so easy to kind of do wrong by it, even if you think you're doing right. So I actually really can't choose one person. I really can't, because I feel that would be not in the spirit of the thing. But maybe instead what I can do is, because I think whenever I had this ethical problem, I could always bring it back to me. And actually, because I am a product of the youth club, like you say, I worked on a youth project for a long period of time, Live Magazine, also based in Brixton. And I currently work at an after-school music project in Woolwich called Woolwich Creative Club. And I'm taking the book in and out to youth projects all the time to talk about the book in the youth club, whether that's in Stockport or in Coventry or wherever. So if I can't choose a character, I can talk about me and the things that I see. And there was a really lovely moment in Stockport where I met a group of young people and their youth worker. The youth worker's called Earl. He does detached youth work in Stockport. And I met this group of young people and they were really lively and they told me they were into youth theatre. So I thought, I'll read a little bit in the book about a woman who was young in the 80s and her experience of youth theatre and how it really changed her life. And she described herself in the book as being part of what she described as the bus stop lot, and then described all the sort of like teenage, like, things that they got up to. So I read this bit out. And then one of the young people, she just kind of, indicated she wanted to speak. And she said, that could have been us. There was a big fight at the bus stop today, but we didn't go because we've got Earl and we love Earl. And I'm sitting on this panel with Earl thinking, this is the most beautiful explanation of why youth work matters on an individual level. And also how these stories are just so portable between different moments in time. I found that very tender.
If you're enjoying this conversation, hit subscribe or follow to make sure you don't miss out on the next one. And feel free to leave a comment or a review. Just to be clear, I think that the book is full of those as well. So for anyone listening, it's like you sort of, it's like you kind of set up context and then you provide this personal story where you get to hear dialogue or these moments from across time in these really intimate moments from young people, youth workers, etc., all across the country. And I think often it's easy for Londoners to just focus on London, but also to have had that geographical diversity in the book I felt like I learned a lot, basically. You decided to stop telling the story in 2010. So the book sort of comes to an end. That's obviously when the government changed to become the coalition government of the Conservatives and Liberal Democrats, and when austerity began. Why did you decide to do that?
Well, a book's got to begin somewhere and it's got to finish somewhere. It can't just keep on going till like last week. So it had to finish somewhere. And I think there are so many other books to write about this subject. Obviously, also you are someone who's contributed to the canon of this work. But there are so many other stories to be told about after 2010. But I thought, if I can tell this story over this long period of time, which was much longer than I anticipated, then I'm going to come to a hard stop. And the hard stop is austerity. We had something which had been built up over 100 years, which was uniquely British, actually, which was incredibly powerful, which motored invisibly so many different parts of our society. And in a way, I need people to understand the impact of that. And I can't do that by continuing to talk about like what happened afterwards, because afterwards was a different world. In terms of impact, it's almost pandemic-like, an impact which will continue to play out like the pandemic continues to play out for the young people who were young during it and for those who are coming through in the aftermath of it. So it was that serious that I needed to give that feeling of like, why? Why did we let this thing go? Why did youth clubs suffer so disproportionately? No one in councils wanted to close them, but they did, because they didn't have the money to keep them open anymore. So you can't blame councils for closing you can't blame local authorities for closing youth clubs at any point in history, but you can blame the government that doesn't provide the funding for it.
So since 2010, over 1,200 publicly run youth centres have closed across the country. Local authority expenditure for youth services has almost halved over the last decade from now. We're actually entering a kind of new era, at least it seems that way, because over the last maybe 1 or 2 years since the change of government, and I think wider culture and sort of commentary on this issue now accepts that the cuts to youth services and youth clubs has been quite catastrophic. I feel like when I was making this argument in journalism in the late 2010s, it didn't feel like that was the common accepted wisdom. It does now feel more like that. The Youth Endowment Fund has increasingly lent into this area, especially over the last year. So I just wanted to give a bit of context for that. In a survey of 10,000 teenagers, we found that those who are directly affected by violence are twice as likely to attend youth clubs than those who aren't, which obviously tells you about the type of young person that hangs out at a youth club and the potential role they can play in communities that are most affected by violence. A study by Carmen Villa at the Institute of Fiscal Studies, which I'm glad to see that you reference towards the end of the book, of youth club closures across London between 2010 and 2019, found that crime increased when youth clubs closed. So children and young people living in areas where all youth clubs shut became 14% more likely to commit crime than their peers in areas where all youth clubs remained open. And we're now funding a study to take that national, to try and kind of realise the impact of those cuts nationally. In our youth sector practice guidance, the Youth Endowment Fund is making a recommendation to open new youth clubs to improve access for the most vulnerable young people and increase funding for existing youth clubs. All of this is to say that we're getting behind them as a violence prevention tool.
Brilliant.
From your travels, from your conversations and your research, why are youth clubs so important for keeping young people safe?
Whilst I want to jump to the idea of violence and risk and to kind of sift through that a bit, I think the simple reason why youth clubs keep young people safe comes back to that first question about how did I keep myself safe? Well, we did it together. So if you have a space that young people can go to regularly with other people, then they're in an environment where their peers are able to see what's happening. And you have that kind of like positive peer pressure that can take place. Obviously, there's also negative peer pressure, but I think we undervalue or underestimate positive peer pressure. What does it mean when you're in a kind of youth club environment and you see someone doing something amazing, like, oh, it's possible for me to be slightly different? There's also that safety net of those youth workers. I'm going to avoid using the word trusted adults because I think that can really muddy the waters when actually really we need to be making sure that youth workers have jobs, are valued. And so I'm going to stick to youth worker when I'm talking about these people.
I guess it's, trusted adults can mean lots of different things.
Exactly.
Youth workers are specific.
Exactly. And so you have a youth worker who understands to notice what's happening, to be able to see who might need a little bit of extra support, and to do so in a really careful way, which is kind of what is necessary when young people are stepping into their own agency. You know, the value of, say, unchaperoned spaces in what it means to become a young adult. You know, for example, getting the bus, often an unchaperoned space, which means the bus is a place where you can learn how to be in public and how you can learn to be with other people. So the youth club is valuable because a young person can find the things they're interested in, have a space to be on their own terms, discover maybe who they are, and encounter other young people and adults in a broadly positive environment, which is not their bedroom. And I think the bit of data in the report that sits underneath the new National Youth Strategy, which is half of our young people spend most of their time in their bedroom, is the biggest alarm bell of all.
The way I always thought about the value of having a youth club in the context of preventing crime and violence or keeping young people safe, like kind of preventing harms, is often that a lot of the young people, and especially boys and young men, teenagers in South London, when I was working there as a youth worker, who would enter the youth club, were often leaving pupil referral units or alternative provisions. They weren't spending all the time at school. They'd turn up at like 2 p.m. at the youth club and be like, I'm here. It reflected the importance of that space for them. They're often those who are disproportionately ending up involved in crime. So there's, on the one hand, school or a lack of proper schooling is potentially leading young people to the youth club to make them safe. The other element of it is that, especially in urban communities, in inner city communities, where when they're at school, they're maybe not feeling completely included. When they're out on the roads, also, they're potentially dodging all sorts of different risk factors, including the state in the form of police and being stopped and searched. So often there's this kind of cocktail of experience going on for a young person on their way to the youth club that meant, I think, that the space ends up becoming this really, really valuable place for keeping them safe. And I think the thing you just threw into the mix, which is a like modern technological trend, is that even when they're going home, which often, you know, that could be to do with parent and carers not being in a suitable state to look after them often, but it could also, you know, the risks attached to only being in your bedroom for that amount of time, that adds a whole new layer to this, right?
Absolutely. Because it's all about so much, it's incontrovertible that connection is good for us, like on a species level. Connection and feelings of belonging, knowing people, being in social environments, it's really important on every single level. And that's really how you kind of how safety works when you look at it in a broader way. So the idea of people being isolated by all those factors that you quite rightly describe means that it's more important that there are spaces that people can access if they want to. And, you know, I was working at Live magazine a period, I think, like maybe that overlapped with your time at Marcus Lipton. I was there till about 2013, so maybe it was a bit more of a relay one to the other. But we would also have had, you know, young people coming in to the office, which was a magazine office. It was a magazine run by young people within a kind of like marketing office, who in other environments would have been very different. But because they're coming into a magazine office, and myself and the other editorial mentors would be like, oh, so what do you want to do? Do you want to do a review of a record? Or can you write something about this YouTube video? People behave differently. And so you would have like an environment in which the very limited way that you could be in that environment was expanded. And I think about that a lot. I was watching this like roadman comedy dude. What's his name? Sunshine Marley, maybe. I just happened to see it, and it was like the video was, you know, what would happen if like roadmen told each other how they really felt. I just happened to come across it, and I thought it was really charming and really funny. And I thought, wow, comedy is such a great way to be dealing with these issues of like extreme issues that you're talking about, which do affect people who are racialized or otherwise marginalized more, but also contribute to the kind of the way that racism plays out and classism plays out, sort of contributes, I think, as well to that, to the negative impressions that people have. But what I'm saying here is this use of comedy as a tool against violence really struck me, and it reminded me of a time at Live magazine where some of the young people made a video about this made-up gang called the Tissue Paper Crew. And it was like a project just to keep people busy who were maybe a little bit more at risk of things going wrong for them. So they'd come into the office on a Saturday, come up with this idea about this gang where like their insignia was like loo roll. And, you know, it's really funny. It's still on YouTube. And then a week or so afterwards, one of the young people came in with like just like wearing head to toe bandanas of a particular colour, which suggested a particular gang affiliation in Brixton at that time. And I just remember saying to them when they walked in, that's a lot of bandanas, and you just made a film last week about all of that. And then when they came back in the office, they weren't wearing the bandanas. Now, I'm not saying that this is going to work for everyone, but I just think sometimes when you're dealing with such hardcore things, it's kind of useful to go around the edges sometimes. You know, it's like if you ask people to identify themselves in one way, you're making them more like it. So if you say, oh, you're a comedian, or you make videos, or you're going to do this or that, then suddenly like it becomes possible to inhabit a different version of yourself. And I saw that repeatedly in the youth club story.
Your story just then reminded me a bit of the ping pong table. It's like this symbol of the youth club, right? It's like a parody, but it's like a caricature, but it's also an important symbol, because I think just playing table tennis or just playing PlayStation or just sitting there using the mains to charge your phone in a bricks and mortar space is deceptively important.
Yes.
If you're young and you don't feel like you fit in the world,
Yes.
and you're feeling at risk outside, you know, those simple things, and it you know, it may be less simple to be sort of mentored in your career, but I think like the type of conversation that can happen, whether it's comedy or like taking part in like kind of relaxed sport, those things can actually add up to being really, really important.
Huge. And if you imagine like what happens if you imagine like a safe place where you feel good, you know, it's a place where you can go in and you can like take off your bag, metaphorically and
Yeah.
literally. You can put some stuff down for a minute. Now, not everybody can do that in their lives on a day-to-day basis in other environments. But everybody needs somewhere where they can just shed the load a tiny bit. And I think for me, the youth club or the youth project or that kind of space is a place where that can happen. And I have seen it happen. And then I heard it told to me on multiple occasions in the youth club story. So yeah, it's a place where you can divest yourself of your troubles, even temporarily, and that's valuable.
And that's hard to measure. And I think this is maybe a useful time to sort of transition onto this, which is to think about the tension of trying to prove that something works, which you refer to a few times in the book. Mm-hmm. Now, one of the main things that the Youth Endowment Fund does is try to prove what works. So we do lots of evaluations, we sort of test things, we fund things in order to try and understand their value, understand how to make them as good as possible, understand whether they work to prevent violence. It's difficult to do that with lots of these things we're talking about. Not impossible, but difficult. It kind of goes back to that intergenerational power that I said that a lot of youth workers, especially more experienced, like youth club managers have, where there's like human magic there that plays out over like 20 years. In the same way that I think like when people talk about their grandma's food, it's hard for me to tell you in like quantitative terms why my grandma's food, why I miss it so much, why it meant so much to me, why it tasted so good. But it did. And that's a fact for me. And
your face is transmitting that.
Exactly. So, and I think that's really difficult to prove that. I think it's important that we try and find ways of doing that. But it struck me a lot of times in the book, and it made me really sit back and reflect both on sort of my role at the Youth Endowment Fund, trying to make sure we prove what works and to maintain doing that, but also be sensitive to the fact that a lot of things that matter sits outside of that remit, right? I'm just going to read out one of the lines from the book and then I'm going to ask you about it. So the value of youth clubs remains hard to explain. As with so many aspects of community, they exist in an economy of relationships and feelings. Their impact is hard to see because those with structural power probably didn't attend them, making them invisible or at least abstract to those who hold the purse strings. It's worth repeating that the connections between the youth clubs across time and space are so numerous, connected like elements of the natural world, entwined roots under the woodland of recent history. Aside from appreciating that from a literary point of view, especially that final line, you refer a number of times in your book to this idea of like focusing on measurable outcomes, focusing on violence and crime, potentially also being dangerous.
Yeah.
Can you just talk me through that perspective?
I mean, there are so many things to say about this. There really are. I feel a kind of sense of fury at the imposition of targets or the way that measurement skews the work. And then I feel a sense of so much pride in the way that those who do this work will make it work regardless, that they will keep those stresses or those negative effects away from the young people as much as possible. And the work will still happen, but it just becomes much harder when you're being asked to do impossible things. I'm thinking straight away about, there's a lot of talk in the book about the north of Ireland, about Northern Ireland, and imagining a situation where you're having to declare who's coming through the doors in terms of their faith background, perhaps, when the whole point of the space is that it exists outside of that. And so if you're asking people to declare themselves as one or the other, you're immediately making it impossible for some people to arrive. And you're bringing people's outside identities with them through the door. Why would you do that? It's the complete opposite of what needs to be done. So the thing with evidence is it's very easy to cherry pick. And I feel that people often cherry pick things which are somehow easier or certainly cheaper. So if, for example, you're talking about evidence for work around mental health in schools, then why are people not looking at the DfE report last year, which showed that not only did it not work, that it caused negative effects? So there was a survey of a particular pilot, and it showed very clearly that this was like not the thing to do, partly for some of the reasons that you're talking about. Some people are not in school in the same way. Some people don't have good experiences in school. But then also imagine the difference between sitting in a classroom with all your peers and your teacher saying, don't do this, don't do that, violence is bad, this is how you keep yourself safe online, and like making a video in a youth club with your friends about those things. The information goes in differently. And I mean, no disrespect to teachers who also, alongside youth workers, are some of the best people in the world doing incredible work. I really value what they do, and it's not either or, but it's a different role with different professional constraints. And the youth worker is ideally placed alongside teachers and families to fill a different role. And they can do things, they can create environments where things can happen that can't happen in other environments.
It's so valuable for those of us working in funding spaces and research and who are making recommendations to government about the evidence and what works, to just remember this.
Yeah.
And I think I personally see it as a working in partnership where I think the proving quantitative impact is really important for trying to efficiently make a really strong case in the world that we live in, where the government listens to it and makes decisions based on it.
Imagine if we worked instead on the basis of trust, on the basis of training people properly and having sensible oversight and operating from that position of trusting that it works, because we know it works even if it's kind of hard to prove in certain ways. Then instead of spending money on things which look good as opposed to actually being good, instead, I don't know. I mean, it might be that I'm working from a position that's just completely unrealistic, but I do think that trust is a missing part of it. And I wonder what would happen if there were studies that allowed people with structural power to make the argument for training youth workers, trusting youth workers, and letting the work happen, and finding ways to describe the human magic, the phrase that you used earlier, that does happen in those rooms and can be seen on an individual. And maybe it's actually something as simple as longitudinal studies. We don't have enough of those.
Agreed. Yeah.
And if we did have those for youth work, then maybe you have then got the evidence to do what I'm saying, which is what happens if you operate from a position of trust, as opposed to what happens if you operate from a position of evaluation. So longitudinal studies actually would be also extremely useful in schools. So there's no longitudinal studies on whether the academy programme works or makes any difference. And perhaps the absence of the longitudinal study is useful for governments to be able to do X, Y, or Z. But it's certainly in youth work, it would be helpful.
Well, I think it also, it zooms out more, doesn't it? And looks over a longer period of time, which is the kind of human magic, the intergenerational significance of somewhere like a youth club or a youth worker that's been in the community for a long time. It takes time, and recognizing that is important as well as part of doing evaluations. I think, I suppose one of the challenges I have for the position of just relying on trust and sort of dismissing the value of evaluations.
It's not either or, is it?
No, exactly. But one of the really important things that I will kind of stand by and think that the amount of times I saw bad work being done as a youth worker is not, I think that's a disservice, and I think that's an injustice as well. And I think a lot of the time that's happening because people are allowed to just do what they want. And there are people doing work who are in a position where they can make a decision to just run a program and not actually rigorously trying to figure out the end result of that program is also dangerous. I think there's dangers at either end of this.
But do you always know what the end result is? Sometimes I think, sometimes it's important to say, wow, like we've got a group of young people, or we've got a nation where half our young people are spending most of their time in their rooms. Let's try a few things, or let's try a few things out using our sense of what might work and tweak that in collaboration with the people who are taking part, because if it's not right, they won't come. I mean, the other thing, actually, I read something in one of the Youth Endowment Fund reports about the numbers of young people who had been asked to be involved with drugs in some way, like carry drugs, hide drugs, money, all those sorts of things. And the numbers were massive. So 1 in 8 of 10.6 million young people in this country, you're talking about 900,000. You're talking about almost 1 million young people who in some way have been involved in the drugs trade.
Yeah, and roughly 1 in 30 say yes to it.
When I read that, I was like, wow, this is like narco levels of young people being involved in a global trade, which is extremely dangerous. That also, when I've been thinking about things to do with this and to do with the book, those two stats really stood out to me. 50% of our young people are spending most of their spare time in their rooms, probably alone, maybe with siblings in and out, but essentially isolated.
Often on their phone, I guess.
Isolated. And, online is real, online is fine, online has plenty of good things in it, but also is broadly being instrumentalized or it's a central place for far-right radicalization, for example. So I just thought, wow, on one hand, you've got tech billionaires, and then you've got like narco land really, really, really heavily embedded in the lives of our young people in ways that are hard to see unless you do hear a hard statistic like that, which again for me makes it all the more important that we've got like a place where someone can go. One of the young people who are quoted in the research that sits behind the National Youth Strategy said, there's only one football pitch around here and it's all full of year 9s and men on motorbikes. But it's like, you can imagine he's an 11-year-old who said it. You can imagine them, but that's just the reality. So that 11-year-old might be one of those people who's either just stuck in their room because there's nowhere to go, or one of those like 900,000 plus young people who somehow are, getting involved in the contrails or entrails of the drugs trade. And that means that it's really even more important that we just find spaces for people to go and do like trampolining or running or
and
basketball and just have fun. Because
it's hard to measure fun.
If you're just having fun, you're much less likely to engage in hatred against other people because you're just having too much of a nice time. And there's a better chance of you having been able to rehearse kind of practically or just sub-low ways to say no when someone says, oh, do you want to just do this? Be like, oh no, I've got to go to basketball practice, or no, I'm just going to go and make a video, or oh no, I'm just going to youth club, or whatever.
Your mention of the word sub-low is a good is a good reference, because I was about to talk about one of the main things I think that sings out of the book, that I personally am very invested in, and I know you are too, just from being music journalists, is that music is arguably like the one of the main, if not the main, products or things that have come out of youth clubs existing. That is one of those like magical things that's hard to measure until it's Femi Colioso winning prizes as part of the Ezra Collective and getting up on stage and saying this was because of youth clubs, or Wiley having built a whole genre in grime. And obviously you interview Wiley's dad in the book, which I love. It's probably my favorite part of the book.
He's great. What a great guy.
I can only imagine. So music has obviously and from two-tone in Coventry to like sound systems in different cities across the country. Where does music sit amongst this? Like, I know there's so much value there, and there's so much that's come out of it. There's genres that have been built in the youth club. I remember Simon Wheatley telling me that the underground of grime was the youth club. Like, they were one and the same thing back in the early 2000s. Why do you think this is such a, what is that connection? Why do you think it's so rich there?
Because I think if you give people space to do things, they're going to do things. And we happened to give space. When I say we, I'm saying like as a society, space to young people who were otherwise, racialized, minoritized, marginalized, to do things. And quite often what they did was make things with the cultural tools of the time that responded to the culture of the time, which often involved music, fashion, style. I think if I was a sports writer, then probably my book would probably be able to make as compelling an argument for the role in UK sport as my book, as a music person, makes for the role of the youth club in like the world of sound. But then also music is the great unifier, isn't it? Music brings us together. And so it's also no surprise that the youth club is an environment in which music would happen and would respond to the music that was happening around it. And that's another just argument for community space, isn't it? The youth club is a pocket of what is required in terms of spaces where people can go and be together and celebrate life events and be able to access affordable life together. Which is why, unfortunately, we need to sort of recognise that the world of the youth club and youth work also sits adjacent to the world of the property developer, and the way that global finance has taken control of so many of our communal spaces, and that is also part of the picture. There's not a lot we can maybe do about that individually, but it's important to recognise that all these things abut each other in very strong ways.
In December 2025, the government published the first national youth strategy in England in over 2 decades. Something that struck me about the book is that you kind of outline the fact that this type of strategy has sort of been outlined, has been written every generation. And there are these cycles of sort of funding cuts and then people making, advocating for the return of youth clubs. And I think it's just interesting to recognise that's happened again.
Yeah.
But amongst the recent national youth strategy and its goals is creating a new generation of welcoming youth spaces. So spending £350 million over the next 4 years to refurbish or build up to 250 youth facilities in areas that need it most. And invest £150 million in 95 places through the Pride in Place Impact Fund. It's a step in the right direction, but is it enough? And, I think it's a positive thing, especially if you take the last 15 years into account. And as I said, the late 2010s stuff was bleak. And I'm not saying it's not bleak now, but I feel like you got to take some of these wins sometimes. Mm-hmm. I accept there's a lot further to go. What's your perspective?
There's no point spending money on buildings or climbing walls or minibuses if you don't have youth workers to open the doors, because they literally will not work. So, of course, it's wonderful that money is being spent in this direction. And I can only imagine the graft that has gone into getting to this point. Huge amounts of work and advocacy, which is really important. But I just feel, again, this comes back to what is easy as opposed to what actually works. And maybe it's easier to have a politician stood by a minibus or by a refurbished youth club than it is to say, oh, we're paying the wages of this person or that person. But again, it's like, I'm sure that there are stories that governments or entities could tell to be really proud about the fact that they are allowing people to open up the doors. There's stories which could be told about the pride in supporting youth work. So for me, I think, of course, it's good that money is being spent, but it's pointless unless there are people to actually do the work. You need to rebuild the workforce before you start rebuilding the buildings. And I don't understand how anyone would think it would work unless you factor that in. I also think that when I first read the strategy, and I've read all of the strategy and I've read the 2 big research documents that sit underneath it. So I thought that I was going to be reading essentially a youth service strategy. And I was confused by lots of it because I didn't understand what I was reading. And now I understand it's not a youth service strategy. It's a youth strategy in a much broader sense. And then when I read the version of the document which is aimed at young people, I thought, oh, now I understand a different way of looking at what this is. It's a mini manifesto for young people who will be old enough to vote at the next election, as opposed to really focusing on the youth service as it was, because it doesn't really exist anymore, does it? So it's a youth strategy which is about encouraging youth voice in government and about showing younger young people what the government is doing for them. I also think there's something very dangerous about this report, which is its absolute, determined, conscious failure to use the word racism or to use the phrase LGBTQ+. And it states that it's based on conversations with 14,000 young people. And you're telling me that none of them used those words? None of them. I don't believe it. So it struck me that those words had been removed from the strategy in conscious ways. And I think that is extremely unsafe. Because if the government can't use the word racism or anything in that world, or it can't use words that relate to queerness or other forms of marginalization, then how can those young people be safe if their realities can't even be mentioned? The phrase LGBTQ does exist at the very end of the strategy in the glossary, but I don't know if that was an oversight or a signal.
Right.
And of course, I might be completely wrong. No young person may have mentioned these words. That might be possible, but I find that hard to believe. And especially when you read the longer research document, which was done by the Children's Commissioner, it's full of young people talking about issues in school and issues with the police and the way that racism and Islamophobia plays out. And yet it says in the strategy, even more than access, you told us that you wanted your voices to be heard. That's not what the young people said in the research. They said we want places to go. They didn't say we want to tell you about how we want them to be run. I'm all for youth voice, but there's no point doing that if you don't have the foundations right, which is places for young people to go and be, and then contribute to the running of or the decisions about. Again, that's cheap. Youth voice is cheap. Youth workers, maybe not so much.
Agreed.
Agreed.
I mean,
it's so hard not to essentially go off on one because it just matters so much. And I wish it was slightly different.
No, and you care, and you've written a whole book about youth clubs, so you should care about them, and you're in the best position to make these kind of calls, and everyone needs to listen to them. I think we'll leave it there. I think we'll leave it. Thank you, Emma, so much for joining us in this conversation.
Thank you. It's been a real pleasure to talk to you about it. Thank you.
If you'd like to find out more about how to keep young people safe from violence, hit the link in the description.